So this study investigates the impact of reading fiction compared to non-fiction on mental well-being and prosocial behaviour. So fiction reading is said to have special benefits over non-fiction reading. This was when people read fiction, they're encouraged to put themselves in the shoes of the character, to identify with a perspective that's quite different to their own. And that's a process people go through when they empathise with other people. So fiction reading is said to improve empathy. Fiction reading also can more likely to induce a flow state. The flow state is associated with the activation of the parasympathetic system, which is the relaxation and rest and digest system. And this system has been associated with better well-being. And the activation of that system leads to well-being benefits, and researchers state that therapists should prioritise the activation of this system over things like CBT, or should definitely consider it more in future therapeutic interventions. So reading is implemented in therapy through bibliotherapy. There are two main types. So there's standard bibliotherapy, which involves non-fiction and self-help. There's creative bibliotherapy, which involves fiction reading and poetry and things like that. The definition is quite vague. It's kind of defined as the therapeutic use of reading as an adjunct to psychotherapy, or the use of reading to help the client. Most research suggests that it's best practice to kind of implement reading in the therapy session, to ask the client to reflect or talk about the reading, but not all agrees. There are some who say that reading can be used as an alternative to therapy for those who are unable to access it, or who suggest that it's fine for therapists to recommend or prescribe books for clients to read in their own spare time. So aspects that reading fiction improves, like empathy and theory of mind skills, are essential components of prosocial behaviour. Prosocial behaviour, helping friends, family, giving to charity, helping the community, that type of behaviour has been linked to the activation of the parasympathetic system because it improves people's well-being. People get well-being benefits from acting in that manner. People who act prosocially also tend to have, display higher rates of empathy and theory of mind skills. But there's been very little research in psychotherapy investigating the benefits fiction reading could have for client prosocial behaviour. There's been studies in other fields, but these usually consist of giving participants a short fictional extract to read and then taking their scores on prosocial behaviour, different aspects of prosocial behaviour. Like one study investigated whether they're more likely to give to charity, another study investigated whether they'd pick up a pen the experimenter dropped, and obviously the participants weren't supposed to know that the experimenter dropped that pen on purpose, but taking scores like that or in that manner immediately after an intervention and then concluding it enhances prosocial behaviour isn't very useful for psychotherapy, because they were taken immediately after the experiment, and obviously we're concerned with long-term change and benefits for clients. So despite the clear link between empathy and fiction reading and theory of mind skills and fiction reading, Canny and Robertson say there's a lack of empirical research demonstrating that reading fiction leads to better psychological well-being and other benefits for people. And they suggest that there's this universal belief that reading fiction is good for people. They say there needs to be more research to actually prove that, or more empirical research to prove that. One factor that could be limiting other studies, they suggested, was that people in most studies are given an extract to read, and so readers aren't given a huge amount of choice, and reading preference, they're individual, so that could impact the studies. And they kind of suggested that giving readers more choice would more likely lead to reading enhancing empathy and enhancing well-being. But so they did conduct a study, and their study they did give people more choice of the text they read, and they found that reading fiction, when people were allowed more choice, actually didn't lead to any benefit. And based on this, they conclude that people need to temper down the expectation that reading fiction leads to better well-being. But issues with the study were that although they did give people more reading choice, Still, it was under almost like exam-like conditions. People only had a certain amount of time to read, and the choice was still constrained to the extracts that they had presented. So I don't think that's good enough to kind of suggest that reading fiction has no well-being benefits, because evidence suggests that if people are reading in a natural environment or reading their own favourite books, then that's more likely to lead to people engaging with the text more. Yeah, and another reason why we need to kind of measure well-being as well is there is a link clearly between prosocial behaviour and well-being, but it's not always correlated, and there'd be very little point encouraging people or encouraging therapists to encourage their clients to improve the prosocial behaviour if it didn't also lead to a corresponding increase in psychological well-being. So participants' scores were taken for well-being and prosocial behaviour before the reading intervention. Participants were then separated into two different groups randomly, a fiction group and a non-fiction group. They were asked to read a text of their own preference from either category for 10 minutes a day for 7 days at least. And after reading for 7 days, they were asked to take the prosocial and well-being tests again. So this is an example of the prosocial behaviour scale that we asked participants to fill in before and after the intervention. As you can see, it's got 16 different items that measure prosocial behaviour, attitudes, feelings. And so this shows an example of the questionnaire used to measure for psychological well-being, and it consisted of 14 different items, and as you might be able to see, it considers, feelings, happiness, and also importantly it considers functionality as well, how somebody is functioning in their day-to-day life is important. So I conducted a mixed between within subjects analysis of variance for both psychological well-being and prosocial behaviour. So the test run for psychological well-being did not reveal any significant main effect for book category. It didn't reveal any major or significant effect for time, and there was no interaction effect either, even though the graph kind of shows that the lines interacted. For psychological well-being, the results were similar. There was no main effect of book category, there was no main effect for time, and there was no interaction effect either. So we came to different conclusions than some of the other researchers did, and this might have been because of the measures we used. So we measured prosocial behaviour on a 16-item scale, so that scale measured a variety of behaviours, feelings and emotions that contribute to people acting in a prosocial way. Some of the other studies that found that reading fiction did enhance prosocial behaviour only measured one of those items on that 16-point scale, like picking up a pen or donating to charity. So they may have picked up on the fact that reading fiction can lead to an improvement on one or two items or one or two aspects that encompass prosocial behaviour, but our research shows that it doesn't lead to an overall improvement in prosocial behaviour. And another thing our measure was better at was picking up on confounding factors. So there were quite a few reasons why somebody might feel like picking up an experiment as a pen, and that could be due to kind of social pressure, feeling that they had to conform or wanted to impress the experimenter. Research shows that prosocial behaviour from social pressure isn't necessarily correlated to well-being, and that prosocial behaviour leads to well-being, or is more likely to lead to well-being when it's when somebody genuinely does it to help somebody else. And because of our scale considered so many different aspects like feelings, emotions and behaviours, then it was more likely to record whether it is a genuine change in prosocial behaviour. So there's some studies that have recently investigated whether reading fiction improves well-being, that found that it has. One of these was by prosocial, but they based their conclusions on participants' self-reports. So people were stating that reading fiction had improved their mood, but this was based on self-report, and sometimes they were remembering effects from reading fiction well in the past. And this is significant because memory tends to get weaker with time. Also, the measures used by prosocial, like mood improvement and self-esteem, because of this factor, were not validated. Another reason why we may have come to non-significant findings and others have, like prosocial, is because we considered functionality. So as part of our wellbeing scale, functionality was an important part of it, and functionality is considered vital by the NHS and local councils as an indicator that people's well-being is improving or has improved. And so that's another reason why. So perhaps Trosianko's study shows that reading fiction can make people feel a bit better, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a substantial change in or improvement in well-being. And as counsellors, if we're going to kind of use fiction to help clients, it needs to be shown that it leads to an actual benefit, overall benefit in well-being and functionality. So what does this mean for counselling? Well, it suggests that researchers who recommend reading fiction for people who are unable to access therapy perhaps should be a bit more cautious before doing so. Also, there's a theme in the literature of researchers encouraging therapists to kind of signpost clients to bibliotherapy services and reading more. It suggests, even though our sample size is quite small and it's hard to generalize, that reading fiction doesn't help everyone, and that they shouldn't universally signpost people to reading or to bibliotherapy services. Another aspect is a debate in bibliotherapy whether clients should be recommended a book by a therapist or whether the client should be given the choice to choose their own book. Some argue that choosing a book themselves might be more beneficial to clients because they'll enjoy the book more and they'll engage with it more, and that is more likely to lead to well-being benefits, but our evidence suggests that it wouldn't make much difference. And also another aspect to consider is the fact that many clients ask, surveys show, therapists for their own, for book recommendations by the therapist. And it kind of brings into questions whether therapists should engage with that, because it doesn't necessarily lead to improved well-being, and it might lead clients to false hope and even waste their time. There is research to show from Carney that reading fiction and engaging in a discussion might lead to more well-being or prosocial behaviour benefits. And because quite often clients in bibliotherapy often attend book discussions and things like that also, the research by Carney suggests that people could derive benefits from reading fiction and discussing them with friends, family and so on, and that a therapist wasn't necessarily needed to gain those benefits. So it kind of, therapists would need to consider whether there's any use in discussing books in therapy with clients if they already have that outlet outside of therapy, because the 50-minute client hour, there could be things that it could be a more useful use of that time to discuss something else rather than discussing a fictional text. So we need more up-to-date surveys to determine how therapists are using fiction with clients, whether they're just recommending it because they think it will, as an activity to do outside a therapy session because they think that will improve well-being, or whether they're actually discussing the books and engaging and reflecting on the literature in session with clients. The latter has been shown by Carney to perhaps be more effective. We'd replicate our own study, but longer term with more participants. A longer time might give people more time to connect with the characters in their books. We'd insert a fiction discussion group as well and a non-fiction discussion group. That would allow us to gauge how important discussion is to enabling fiction to provide people with well-being benefits. We could also have, as a separate study, study that had clients in a book group and who underwent psychotherapy against clients who were just in a book group, and that would tell us, well, whether it's worth therapists discussing literature with clients who already have that outlet outside the therapy room.